20 years ago, a video game was released that failed to meet expectations. The developers had labored over the game for 3 years and invested so heavily into it that they were extremely exposed to a poor sales performance. When that performance came, there was nothing Troika Games could do to avoid folding to the financial pressures. Ironically, the game that caused their collapse would go on to be recognized for its brilliance, and years later, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines' reputation would be leveraged by a different company to market a sequel. That sequel hasn't come without its own pressures, and, much like its predecessor at release, Bloodlines 2 is facing broad negativity. Complaints of clunky combat, minimal source material implementation, feeble RPG elements, and technical issues abound, leaving many to conclude that the Chinese Room were unsuccessful in their efforts to create a Bloodlines sequel. But something about these complaints sounds rather familiar, and in a way, I fear that Bloodlines 2 is the ideal follow-up to Troika's game. From the engaging and characterful writing, right down to the developers being lorded over by a meddling publisher, Bloodlines 2 has far more in common with its ancestor than it might first appear, and I can only hope that what happened next isn't hereditary. I feel that might be a bold statement, and the rest of the video will revolve around evidencing that claim, but I also have some other questions that I would like answers for. Those of you who watched my previous video will know that I created a criteria for fulfillment of what I called the vampire fantasy. Basically, a set of questions that evaluate whether the game does an effective job at putting the player in a vampire's shoes. Is the player character powerful but tragic? Is their connection to humanity tentative and wavering but recoverable? Do they exist outside of their original context? Do they feed upon humans? And, in the case of these adaptations of a tabletop RPG, are the decision points faithful to the source material? Not all of the games I talked about before managed to fully satisfy all of these questions, but they each provided enough material to satisfy me. Except Earthblood, because that game is about werewolves. Of course, I'm also going to tell you whether or not I enjoyed Bloodlines 2, and if I think it's a game worth playing. I do have an immediate caveat, and a bit of a warning about the rest of the video too. My CPU did not like this game. It's a couple of years old at this point, and running Bloodlines 2 and my recording software regularly push the little guy to its limits. There will be dropped frames in my footage, but your mileage may vary. At least the game runs now.
Understood. Good. For my sake, I hope you stay. I'll run out of thin blood soon enough. Don't want to be bored.
Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is an action game with a smattering of role-playing elements. Players embody an elder vampire named the Nomad, who awakens in a dingy Seattle basement. Dazed and lost, the vampire also discovers that their body has been ritualistically scarred while they were asleep, and a whole other person seems to be occupying their mind. Fabian, this second consciousness, finds his own presence within the Nomad's head confusing, but does his best to acclimatize his host before they make their way into the wider city beyond. From here, the rest of the game revolves around navigating Seattle's unusual Camarilla organization, trying to solve the mystery of the Nomad's scarring, and discovering the secrets of their Malkavian passenger. There are alleyways to skulk through, gangs of mortals and immortals to beat up, powers to unlock, and plenty of vampires to talk to. Those vampires will ask the Nomad to do things, to investigate stuff, to kill people, and most of those tasks involve traveling to a location, fighting through all of the enemies within it, and reaching the objective at the far end. Repeating this process enough times for enough vampires eventually results in all of Seattle's secrets being unearthed, so we had better hope it's dirt worth digging. Bloodlines 2 is a much more linear experience than the first game. An objective is decided, a waypoint is placed in the UI, the player goes to that location and completes whatever the task is. The first character the player will meet upon leaving the tutorial area is Benny. Benny is the current sheriff of Seattle, although he's presently on a bit of a murderous rampage, furiously destroying as many thin-blooded vampires as he can in pursuit of some vague vengeance. The new Camarilla Prince of Seattle, Ryong, needs her sheriff brought into line, and she will allow the Nomad to operate in the city freely if Benny is stopped. So, the player is sent out into the city to track him down and do whatever is necessary to end the bloodshed. Since he's on the hunt, Benny won't be found just standing around somewhere, so the player must utilize the Nomad's heightened sense of smell to follow Benny's trail of destruction around town. There are anarchs patrolling the rooftops to fight while tracking the Bruja vampire that lay the combat system a little bare at this stage of the game. The Nomad's basic combat skills include stealth takedowns, a simple punching attack, and a dash that does a lot more than is explained during the tutorial. I think these attacks work well as a base, and I like the way the player's chosen clan flavorfully changes the punching animations. But I think the enemies and the camera make early fights difficult to follow. The Nomad can punch quickly enough that it'd be trivial to hit stun enemies to death, so there is actually very little hit stun throughout the entire game. Once an enemy has started an attack animation, they will armor through regular punches indefinitely, so the player is incentivized to dodge around and engage in hit and run tactics right away. This constant movement, combined with the heavy use of camera effects, even when set to the minimum, makes tracking enemies challenging. They also reposition often to avoid shooting each other, which exacerbates the generally chaotic nature of the fights a lot. The chaos can be lifted to another level when the player starts to use the Nomad's telekinetic powers in combat. Once I got to grips with the pace of the battles, I found throwing items around to be a lot of fun, and enjoyed the extra layer of tactics it added despite how finicky it was to use at times. Most often, telekinesis is used to throw bricks and bottles to distract enemies from stealth, but you can hit them directly to deal damage and get a guaranteed stagger to use as an opening. Picking up guns is exciting too. I really liked how frantically animated the guns are as the Nomad unloads everything in them, and how you can still throw the spent weapon at the enemies that manage to survive. Benny's trail eventually leads the player to the auto repair shop where the player encounters Max, Benny's youthful sire. The Nomad needs to extract Benny's whereabouts from Max, and they can achieve that through a handful of different conversation paths. Things a Nomad can say in conversation can affect a character's opinion of them, leading that character to be more helpful or antagonistic in future interactions. Max ultimately ends up being a super unimportant character, so you don't have to look at the Killmonger cut too often throughout the game, but he is the first opportunity the player has to hold the power in an interaction. Prior conversations with the Seattle court positioned the Nomad as the vulnerable party. They needed permission to stay in the city to figure out all of their personal mysteries, and the murderous sheriff had just threatened them to leave. Holding the power in the conversation with Max allows the player to explore more aggressive or inflammatory dialogue options, since they don't need to ingratiate themselves with him in order to survive. Of course, the game won't ever let the player fail, but maintaining good relationships with powerful people is kind of important in a Vampire the Masquerade adaptation. Max points the player to the next objective at the next location, and the gameplay cycle begins again. As far as fulfilling the vampire fantasy, I'd say Bloodlines 2 achieves in some respects, but falters in others. The Nomad is indeed quite powerful. They can scale buildings very quickly, they can fall off of those buildings without any consequence. The Nomad can even make use of their telekinesis to double jump and glide. They can crush heads with relative ease, and run fast enough to receive Masquerade violations if observed while running at full speed. The Nomad is also greatly removed from their original context in the world. They need to be given the rundown on modern weaponry when first stepping out into Seattle, and record players and computers also require an explanation.
Computers. Mostly, they're like a very fast telegraph system staffed by idiots. My advice is to leave well alone.
This isn't the first time the Nomad has had to make sweeping adaptations to a new environment, however, so this removal of context doesn't extend much beyond the first hour or so of gameplay. Other things, like the Nomad's humanity and the tragedy of their continued existence, aren't really covered at all. The Nomad has been a vampire for a very long time, and as vampires age, their plight of mortality stops being a point of concern. But as a Vampire the Masquerade game, I think discussion of the character's humanity is paramount to the experience, and the Chinese room don't bother with it. Troika only touched on the protagonist's humanity once during the original Bloodlines, so maybe it just isn't a thing the sub-franchise adapts. There are consequences for eschewing what I believe is a rather core component of the RPG that primarily manifests in the game's narrative, but we'll go into detail about that much later. For now, I'll say that the game misses a lot of opportunities for captivating storytelling because neither protagonist cares that they are monsters. The Nomad has people to punch, and the player's attention is directed toward punching. The player isn't the only other consciousness occupying the Nomad's mind, and Fabian is a vivid dreamer. At the end of each night, the player must return to their haven to wait out the sunlight, and while they slumber, Fabian's hyperactive mind starts whirring. These dreams come in 3 flavors, and it isn't uncommon to see one of each in between the Nomad portions of gameplay. There are the garden dreams, the 1900s dreams, and the modern day dreams. None of these contain much in the way of mechanics. Fabian walks around and talks to people, but I like the perspective shifts and how much they add to not only Fabian's characterization, but a bunch of the other major characters too. We get to see Benny before his murderous rampage, we get to learn why Seattle's court ended up so broken, and we get to talk with Sophia without her drooling all over the Nomad.
Forgive me. It's just the Nomad. Hi.
I think the modern sections are the weakest, mostly because they go on for far too long, and are filled with inconveniences that shouldn't really exist. Fabian is on the trail of a serial killer who targets mortals in close proximity to Seattle's vampires. So, primarily, ghouls. The methods he uses to find clues for this hunt are amusing. I think the strangely flirtatious Peter Griffin filing cabinet is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in a game.
Hello, my little bibliophile. Looking for a booking? Desperate for a dossier?
But the vampire characters that know Fabian really shouldn't bother trying to keep secrets from him. Fabian has the power to read minds. He can make someone perceive him as a person they expect to see. He can revert short-term memories so he can restart a conversation. Fabian will learn your secrets, so why all of these characters bother trying to hide them seems pointless. I understand someone unfamiliar with the Malkavian trying to hide something from him, but Benny should really know better. There's not much to investigate during the 1900s dreams, but at least there's something to do. The garden and the gardener are fascinating, but these dreams are some quintessential Chinese room gameplay that is controversial at the best of times.
Love to have a chat. So what do you say you give me an address?
Oh, Truth Seeker, you are so close.
When the Nomad first makes contact with Fabian, the Malkavian asks their name to try and build some rapport. The Nomad states that they have had many names during their lifetime, but this time around they'll be known as Fire. This name has like 8 connotations and connections going for it within the narrative. These curtains are most certainly not just blue, but the way the Nomad is inspired to pick it is hilariously clumsy. On the walls and door the Nomad sees during their first moments of consciousness are posters for the live performance of a band named Fire. The writers knew that they wanted to have a character say something like, "The Nomad is the second great Seattle Fire," late into the game, and had to get their main character to name themselves Fire for it to work. So they filled the basement in an abandoned, collapsing building with posters for a band with the name that they wanted. And as far as I can tell, there are no more of these posters anywhere else in Seattle. This band only wants to advertise their show to people snooping around in the basement of a condemned building. Which isn't 0 people, I suppose. They could have put these posters outside of the tutorial building and had the Nomad pick the name later. Fabian could have named them. Maybe the computer in the Haven apartment is logged in and the username is Fire. I feel like there are plenty of more elegant ways to attach this name to this character, and the payoff for the name isn't really worth immediately giving players this idea of clumsiness. After the tutorial, the player needs to do the rounds and meet all of the significant players in Seattle's vampire scene, and I think these introductions do a great job of characterizing everyone. Lou Graham is the ex-prince whose agoraphobia caused her to abdicate the throne, but she's still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Tully is the prince's flippant right hand, loyal to the end, but having fun with it. Ryong is the new prince who is trying, but she's clearly out of her depth. and Sophia is the kindly, excitable egghead with a bit of a vindictive streak. The solid characterization also extends to the minor characters positioned throughout Seattle, but they're extremely static and function as representatives rather than leaders of their respective micro-factions. Nines was the face of the LA Anarch movement in the first game, and while it was small, the presence of other Anarch vampires helped to give the impression of a broader scope for the project. Skelter, Damsel, and Jack were clearly members of something more. In the sequel, all responsibilities for the Anarch faction have fallen on Katsumi to bear. She seems to operate alone, despite the majority of early game enemies wearing the Anarch label. Katsumi is also pulling double duty as the Thin Blood rep. Again, the first Bloodlines had multiple Thin Blood characters who seemed autonomous in their own way, but in the sequel, they're lumped in with the Anarchs entirely and are presented only as vermin to be slaughtered by Camarilla loyalists. That being said, in totality, I view this as a largely lateral movement. The Thin Bloods in Santa Monica don't have much to do, and their existence being an apparent signifier of the apocalypse is dropped as soon as the fledgling leaves the city. In Bloodlines 2, they're rejected by the incumbent vampire society and wind up at Katsumi's door, actively looking for a purpose. And a bunch of them somehow manage to trap Benny in a concrete pillar. This second conversation with Benny is odd. The Bruja leaves a lot unsaid, and his stated motivations are contradictory to the role he plays throughout the rest of the game. Benny claims that his primary goal in Unlife is to destroy all of the Thin Bloods, and he only sides with the Camarilla because the court has no interest in the well-being of outsiders. But as far as Fabian is concerned, Benny was quite the diligent sheriff. He hasn't always been this aggressive, and this new rage only came about with the death of the previous prince. The player doesn't learn much about the circumstances surrounding Campbell's death until a long time later, and whether his death had any real effect on Benny is still unclear after all is revealed. For now though, it's time for the game's first boss fight, and it is bland. Benny has 3 health bars to chew through, a few melee combos, and a tracking jump kick that is easy to avoid. A couple of Anarchs show up during the fight for a little added chaos, and for freebie blood refills if the one the player gets from the phase transitions aren't enough. I briefly spoke about the combat earlier, and mentioned how clan affiliation alters the punching animation, but the blood powers are the primary benefits the player receives from choosing a clan. I think there are a handful of clan-specific dialogue options scattered throughout the game, but the clan selection mainly amounts to the abilities the player has access to. As a Banu Hakim, my first iteration of Fire was principally a stealth assassin. The abilities are designed around attacking from stealth, killing 1 or 2 enemies, and then scurrying away to hide and restart the assault. The player has the option to kill or feed upon enemies when undetected. Killing is faster and quieter, feeding restores some health and blood points. Blood is handled differently in Bloodlines 2. Rather than acting like a mana source, feeding adds a point to each of Fire's powers, which need to be fully charged in order to use. So, for example, the first Banu Hakim power requires 3 points and decapitates normal enemies in a single swing, killing them instantly and dealing high damage to tough enemies and bosses. In most cases, this is a once per encounter power, since it requires feeding on 3 enemies to be usable again. I find this system to be far more appropriate than the previous iteration. The Chinese Room have placed a much greater emphasis on action combat than Troika did, so altering the resource system to be easier to understand at a glance, and removing sordid chi strategies like draining enemies to death, suits this style of game far more. As the player progresses through the game, they naturally gain access to more of their clan's spells through leveling up. But it is also possible to buy the other clan's powers from their representatives throughout Seattle to customize builds at minimal cost. I did notice that all of the powers are combat powers only. The few times the player will be able to use non-violent vampire magic is when Fabian takes the reins, which is disappointing. Upon Benny's defeat, the player is given the option to hand the sheriff over to Katsumi to receive some Anarch justice, or bring him back to Ryong as she originally requested. This decision doesn't appear to do anything in the short term. Katsumi will still hold the Nomad at arm's length during later interactions, and Ryong's dissatisfaction isn't significant enough for her to alter any of her plans going forward. The prince still needs muscle, and fire is basically her only option. After speaking with Ryong about Benny, the player is told to go check in on Lu. Since she never leaves her penthouse, Lu is assigned a hunter who finds suitable people for the elder to feed upon. Her newest steward, a gangrel named Nyx, isn't quite capable of appeasing Lu's particular appetite, and the player needs to step in to help. Nyx is deliberately written to be annoying.
What the fuck does that even mean? They all taste the same to me, like chicken nuggets on legs.
This character is designed to be off-putting. Lu explains that she's a big talker, and she is. The task the player needs to complete for this character is extremely easy, and the voice performance is perfectly executed.
This is what it smells like? Ah! Oh my god, thank you.
Bloodlines 2 does this a lot, and I can't help but feel like it was a bad decision. This game was always going to receive an unfair level of scrutiny and bad faith criticism, and making deliberately unlikable characters only adds fuel to that fire. I have no doubt that there are videos filled with clips of the 4 minutes Nyx is on screen, dubbed with commentary decrying the state of modern gaming, but I think the Chinese Room's writers have achieved something here that is incredibly difficult to pull off. They made Fabian likable. This dude talks in the player's ear for the whole game. He cracks corny, unfunny jokes constantly. His gameplay segments involve walking around the city without all of Fire's increased mobility to get to puzzles that are primarily solved through brute force. And yet, I was still rooting for him. The writers almost pulled this off for Nyx too, but she serves a different purpose that will naturally be lost if you only look at the surface presentation. Nyx is a karmic presence for Lu. The gangrel acts as comeuppance for the former prince's misdeeds, but she's also Lu's victim. Nyx is bratty and uncouth, and she lacks expected vampiric experience on account of her youth and recent escape from Idaho, the perfect foil to Lu's refined agelessness. There isn't much to talk with Nyx about anyway, since once the player has completed her task, it's time for bed. This sequence of dreams sets up a pretty big chunk of what's to come for the middle portion of the game, and I think it's the longest Bloodlines 2 goes without allowing Fire to get into a fistfight. There's the obligatory gardener conversation, which is followed by a modern-day Fabian section. The investigation into the copycat rebar killer is heating up, and a young woman named Verona has approached the detective with a sinister handwritten death threat. There are a lot of people and filing cabinets to talk to.
He says here there's an underwater base deep under Puget Sound. Enemy scientists are running aquatic time travel experiments.
But the most significant of these is Isabella, the owner of the popular Atrium nightclub, and one of the more aloof members of the Seattle court. Isabella is supposed to be an artist of some kind, although the media she uses for her art isn't really discussed. She does keep a lot of ghouls and blood dolls around, so it was kind of inevitable that one of them would be murdered by the serial killer Fabian is tracking. And, coincidentally, this latest victim is the twin sister of the woman who had approached Fabian earlier in the night. But before this connection can be explored any further, the dream skips backward 100 years to a party in Lu's penthouse. It's here that Fabian can have an extended conversation with Gideon, his sire, and Sophia. Sophia's resentful streak makes a bit of an appearance here, but I think positioning these two as a regular pairing in conversations is the main takeaway at this time. It's rare that any other vampire joins the player's conversation, but it wasn't until a later dream, where Fabian asks if Sophia and Gideon are an item, that I ever clued into the possibility. The next evening, something major has gone down in the atrium, and Tolly sends Fire in to investigate. When the player does eventually find a way inside, they make their first contact with some Sabbat vampires. They have a little more mechanical complexity than the anarchs the player has been fighting up to this point, but for the most part, they aren't too different. The big guys can teleport, the little ones have better guns, that's about it. But we get to learn what Isabella's artistic endeavors have amounted to. She has been draining vast quantities of blood from the club's patrons in preparation for a ritual, which she managed to perform without impediment. This has also granted Isabella some power over fire through manipulating the mark on the back of their hand, although the elder vampire is still capable of resisting. As the player delves deeper into the club, they will eventually encounter a room full of low-quality humanoid models, stretching and squashing in unison to the beat. This could have been a fantastic horror sequence. The build-up had been excellent, the setting and the lighting set the mood off tremendously, and the conversation with an infatuated Verona make whatever Isabella has planned seem wonderfully menacing. But this crowd model sucks. They're here to introduce the upcoming boss fights gimmick. A bunch of these are going to become aggressive and attack from unpredictable angles. I like the theory of this encounter. Demonstrate the threat in a controlled environment before tossing a boss enemy on top. But it sure sucks to look at. Isabella's actual moveset is very similar to Benny's, but the ambushing thralls are the fight's main threat. Again, this game was doomed to a scornful reception, and I think using low quality assets like this, while it makes sense on a technical level, was a bad idea, and putting something else here would have been a much more savvy decision. And much like Benny, Isabella dies without revealing any useful information to the player. Another member of Seattle's court dead, although it's now clear that the Sabbat are involved in the mystery. Ryong and Tolly don't really know much about the Sabbat, and instead direct fire to another member of the court for information. Willem is the Nomad's next victim, although the player starts their hunt for the Nosferatu without that intention. Willem isn't in his usual hiding place, so the player needs to follow a set of clues to track him down. While leaving Willem's sanctuary, the game drops what might be my favorite video game jump scare.
Behind you.
It got me really good the first time, and it's so simple and obvious. The search for Willem puts the player into more contact with the growing Sabbat contingent in Seattle, and the Camarilla only has a hunch where their base of operations might be. In June of 1889, central Seattle burned down. The blaze grew suddenly and swallowed 25 city blocks in a single day, destroying all of the historical buildings in the middle of the young town. Miraculously, nobody was killed in the fire, and the reconstruction efforts actually attracted more people to the city. Instead of clearing the rubble and rebuilding from the ground, the unusual decision was made to bury the destroyed buildings 6 meters below the new street level and build on top, leaving the city with a series of eerie underground ruins that are still there to this day. Ryong suspects the Sabbat have a base down there somewhere, but she has reservations about sending the Nomad in. Previously, the city's Nosferatu used the underground tunnels to travel the streets undetected, but something chased them out. In a similar way to the first game, the Nosferatu weren't alone in their tunnels. And Lou knows this. After Seattle was rebuilt, sending problem vampires into the underground was a convenient way of getting rid of them, and so she asked Nyx to poke around in the tunnels. The gangrel is dead by the time the player catches up to her, ripped in half by something leaving convenient claw marks leading to its hiding place. The environment and sound design in the underground are fantastic all throughout. Bloodlines has been consistent in this way through the rest of the game too, with the city streets brimming with fun details. But I think this change of scenery really accentuates the overall quality. It's a shame so much time is spent in the city, because the few times the player gets to leave are excellent. The environment artists definitely should have been given more opportunities to let loose and create some more supernatural locations to explore. Another setting would have given the developers a lot of options to expand the world into further, darker depths. Just like how now, currently, there are monsters living under Seattle. Blind, emaciated humanoids. Fire explains that these are vampires who were denied a full embrace. Unbirthed is the name he gives them, and I like how they change up the stealth gameplay. Since they're blind, the unbirthed detect the player via proximity rather than line of sight, which makes ambushing them more difficult than other enemies. I also consistently struggled to read their attack animations, and managed to get mauled a few times while trying to fight through the underground. Eventually, after dealing with a few handful of these new enemies, the player will hear gunfire from a nearby cavern. A room later, the player sees a small squad of mortal vampire hunters gunning down a mob of unbirthed in front of a massive wooden door with the Sabbat mark scratched into it. Fire exclaims that they think the gardener is beyond the door, and rushes after the hunters to try and follow them in. But before they can make it through the door, it explodes and brings down a massive pile of rubble. There's a frantic battle against swarms of unbirthed and hunters, but eventually, Fabian concludes that the Nomad will need to find another entrance to the underground. And there's an easily accessible one under Lou's hotel. It leads to a tangle of very Chinese structures.
No, it's fine. I just didn't think it would be Chinese.
I did though, because it's a Bloodlines game, and in late game Bloodlines, you go to Chinatown. At the end of the corridors, the Nomad can overhear a person named Mother Hen briefing some of the hunters about what they should expect to find in the tunnels, and that the organization is going to lead an incursion into the surface city to try and oust the vampires from Seattle. These heavily armed hunters will be setting up bases on the rooftops after the player leaves the underground this time around. And I think this third enemy faction is an interesting inclusion. The Anarchs and the Sabbat were often already armed to their teeth, but these dudes are on another level. I really like their masks, especially in the foggy, snowy area later on. But it is disappointing that all of the game's enemy factions consist heavily of humans with guns. The Unbirthed hint at the possibility for something more, but there isn't anything like the evil Geodudes or Ming Zhao in Bloodlines 2 at all. That being said, the idea of fighting Ming Zhao again is not in any way appealing, so I think it's best to forget about this idea and move on. After fighting through this second underground section, the player will eventually end up in a buried temple, adorned with a large wooden Sabbat symbol hung over a disembodied fingerless hand. Solving the puzzle causes the hand to transport Fire into the gardener's dream realm. Throughout the last 15 or so hours of gameplay, this guy has been nothing more than a cryptic voice in Fabian's dreams, and finally getting to meet him is narratively very satisfying. Whether the player has figured out who the gardener is by this point is a whole other thing, but I'd guess it's possible to work it out. The gardener is a nude, bald, portly man who holds a powerful resentment towards Lou Graham. She had sent him into the underground to be rid of him, and unwittingly created an enemy of the powerful vampire. Throughout his years of imprisonment, the gardener had sent hallucinations to vulnerable humans and vampires on the surface to do his bidding, somehow resulting in Fire's scarring and the performance of a ritual. The gardener asks Fire to drain him, to complete the ritual with an act of diablerie. He speaks like a Malkavian probably should. It's intense and poetic, but there's a logic to it that can be deciphered with a little thought.
Cain is no longer able, and yet I hear his trumpets. The city flowered in fire, and in fire she will end.
In the first game, Fabian would have talked like this too, but I can understand not wanting to have a companion character jabbering like a lunatic in the player's ear the whole game.
Oh, it is time to sup, dear Nomad, dearest Bacchanalian. I am fair full of juice and ripe for the harvest.
Fire walks to the gardener and lifts the vampire to his feet. The gardener tilts his head in anticipation, but the Nomad does not oblige, opting instead to force their arm through the Malkavian's throat. I think this would have made for an engaging and characterful choice for the player to make. Whether to drain the gardener or to kill him looks like a highly pivotal moment in the game's narrative, but it ultimately ends up being meaningless. Had Fire chosen to drain the gardener here, they would have both learned that the ritual wouldn't work, because the ritual already has transferred one vampire's consciousness into Fire's mind. The fallout between Fabian and the Nomad from choosing to obey the gardener could have been some excellent character drama, but instead, Fire makes the choice, and that's the end of it. There's a final dream sequence after this, featuring the Gideon and Sophia pairing, reminding Fabian of the last time he saw his sire. The vampiric decision-making comes the next night, when the Hunter's base of operations is discovered. The Nomad is sent in to deal with the threat, and after fighting all of the way through to their leader, the player is offered a choice. Sire Mother Hen to appease her in hopes that she keeps her promise and leads the Hunters away, or kill the IAO head and deal with the Hunters for the rest of the game. I don't find this choice to be that compelling. Baker's total screen time rivals Nick's, and the vampire hunters on the rooftops aren't any more troublesome than the Anarchs were. Choosing to sire Baker leads to some mild drama with Ryong, but frankly, at this stage in the story, who gives a shit about Ryong? None of the important narrative moments involve her anymore. The primary plot is only concerned with Lou and Sophia, and Fabian's B-story is just about wrapped up too. The writers obviously haven't forgotten about Ryong, but whether or not she approves of the Nomad's actions hasn't been relevant for hours by this stage. Something that seems like it'd be a big decision, siring your own child, is just like a thing that you can do. And speaking of characters nobody gives a shit about anymore, Katsumi has been leaving town for a regular, mysterious rendezvous, and Ryong and Lou both suggest that she might be the reason the Sabbat have managed to garner such a significant foothold in Seattle so suddenly. If Ryong's relevance to the plot was waning, Katsumi's existence is practically eclipsed. The player is sent to investigate where the Anarch leader is going, which eventually culminates in a meeting with Damsel from the first game. The conversation is just over 2 minutes long, and it is kind of embarrassing. You can ask Damsel why she's here, and her answer is vaguely about Campbell's death and Lou's return.
Did you come to Seattle?
Now that's a good fucking question. Under Campbell, the Emerald City sucked, but it was a dream compared to other hellholes.
And it sounds weird, and the actor's accent slips, and it's all very clear that the only reason Damsel is even in the game is because Hardsuit Labs made that teaser video back in 2020. The player is then given the option to choose their preferred ending. It's very subtle, but these choices seem to coincide with the events that play out in the slideshow at the end. I think this is fine. The player has been able to select loyalty a few times throughout the game, and this final choice just locks it in for the finale. All routes still required the player to defeat the remaining Sabbat forces. Leaving Damsel and Katsumi behind, the Nomad figured that the true reason they had been sent to investigate the Anarchs was to allow Lou and her Sabbat contingent enough time to mount a hostile takeover of Seattle's court. Earlier meetings with Lou suggest she might be seeing dark visions that were influenced in some way by the rising Sabbat presence, and my assumption is that the gardener was causing these. But since Ryong is already the prince, and Sophia's corpse turned up a little while ago, it stands to reason that Lou is the only vampire in Seattle with a motive. So, Fire rushes to Weaver Tower to discover the building is abandoned. In the prince's office, Ryong is paralyzed, staked through the heart, alive, but immobile. From just out of sight, Sophia appears and stakes Fire too. Sophia's villainy is well executed. She has sufficient motivation, her intentions are hidden throughout the rest of the game, but her actions and characterization recontextualize everything effectively. Initially, Sophia appears to be fangirling over the Nomad pretty hard. She contributes to telling the Nomad how famous and important and sexy they are. She seems to go out of her way to help the Nomad get to the bottom of their scarring. She's bashful and nervous when talking to them. Eventually, Sophia forgets formality altogether and starts calling Fire my love openly in conversation.
Until tomorrow night, my love.
And she isn't being dishonest when she says it. Sophia was the reason the Nomad wound up in Seattle. She had the vampire ritualistically scarred in order to prepare them to receive the gardener's consciousness, Gideon's consciousness. But the plan went awry when a plucky detective stumbled into it. Sophia had spent the last century plotting, searching for a way to free Gideon from his imprisonment and take revenge against Lou for sentencing him to it. But now, Fire and Fabian have ruined everything. The Nomad and Ryong are awakened after the sun rises. Ryong is burned in the sunlight, although her death doesn't receive much attention. Instead, Sophia's unmasking and attempt to sway Fire take center stage, which makes sense, but the conversation gestures are unfortunately left out to dry. The actors are putting in some solid performances, but the way Sophia rotates through 3 animation loops over and over undercuts the gravity of the moment a bit.
You know what Lou is, how she wraps kindred and cities alike in choking poison. You want to see her burn.
Fire,
I have a notion.
I will not!
Then I do not need you, fire.
I really like the way Fabian slowly becomes more and more present as the conversation goes on. So much so that Fire has to verbally respond to him while Sophia threatens the vampire further.
Go out of the window.
What?
You still wear the mark. Another can wear this face, can be my sword.
Go out the window.
It would destroy us.
It would reduce you, make you a passenger in your own skull.
Trust me.
It would have been fantastic to have seen Sophia react to Fire yelling, "I trust you, Fabian," before launching himself out of the window. 1,000 pieces would have all settled into place for her as her prize deliberately jumps from the top floor of a building into the sun. The game's limited perspective sort of makes that impossible, but it is quite the one-liner. Fire survives the fall and manages to crawl into a storm drain in front of a small audience on the street. Masquerade violations are utterly meaningless at this stage, as Seattle's Camarilla have almost been wiped out, and the Sabbat are firmly in control. Instead, as the Nomad drags themselves into the sewer, Fabian takes over for the final time. This final investigation segment isn't especially remarkable. It's long. Fabian needs to track down Campbell and confront him as part of the Rebar killer case, and that involves a long daisy chain of fetch quests for a handful of characters. But eventually, Fabian learns that the prince is in a warehouse inspecting a suspicious weapons shipment. During the confrontation, Fabian figures out that he has one hope for survival, and unleashes the Nomad from their torpor. This action set the events of the game into motion. The Nomad drains Fabian and transfers his consciousness. Then the Nomad kills Campbell and flees, triggering the court to panic and Benny to embark upon his rampage against the Thin Bloods. Similar to Sophia's treachery, I think the writers planned Fabian's death marvelously, and I am genuinely impressed with how cleanly it all goes together. I can see an argument for Campbell's command power closing the circle in a contrived manner. Campbell basically uses magic to make Fabian forget that he is the Rebar killer, and force Fabian to drop the case. But Fabian is shown to be persistent, and to have solved the case multiple times in the past. I think that if Fabian is allowed to use magic to interrogate a pool table, then Campbell commanding him to drop the investigation is fair game. It makes Sophia calling Fabian a failure in their final conversation sting that little bit more.
You failed. You couldn't solve it. The one thing I asked you to do.
What are you going to do now?
Somewhere there are answers. Beyond your means. I'm going to find them.
There's still a chance. Maybe he escaped.
If he still existed, he would find me. He would come to me.
I can try to find his body.
What would I do with his bones? And where would you look?
I guess I should say goodbye. I have work to do.
I am leaving the city.
You'll be back.
Oh yes. Someday I will come back to Seattle.
Goodbye, Sophia.
Goodbye, Fabian. I wish you were as good a detective as you think you are.
And it makes saying goodbye to Fabian bittersweet too. He succeeded. He is a good detective. But the case is solved. The game's finale is set up phenomenally, with the bloody footprints all leading out of the sewers, up through the church and into the streets. All of the civilians are gone. The fog is ratcheted up to max, and the soundtrack is grating and oppressive. And then the loop ends to pierce the immersion. Weaver Tower becomes a dungeon again, which is a fun bookend to the first time the player arrived here. The final boss encounter with Sophia on the roof could have been cool. She has some interesting attacks to play around, but the majority of the encounter revolves around killing unbirthed that spawn frequently. You get a couple of hits on Sophia before she jumps away, and then the unbirthed pile on. All of the enemies spawning in, combined with the visual effects like splashes in the big pool of blood, exacerbated the game's poor performance, so I wasn't the only thing relieved when Sophia finally died. On a meta level, I enjoy how appropriate this narrative is. The Nomad is thrust into a position of prominence almost immediately after returning to the world. They're expected to clean up the messes of a cast of characters with their own objectives, their own motivations, their own responsibilities, and doing so has disastrous consequences for everyone involved. The protagonist is accompanied by a helpful voice, someone who has laid the groundwork for a lot of what's to come, but whose ability to take meaningful action has been stricken from them. And the person who seems to be the most helpful, the one who seems most devoted to assisting the Nomad when they're at their most vulnerable, is actually emotionally manipulating them, using the Nomad to fulfill their own selfish goal at the cost of everyone and everything. Sophia even conducts research by examining the ancient texts. Metaphorically, it is shockingly prescient. And Fire too, an old legend, awoken and dragged halfway across the world to obey a master who only chose the vampire because they were familiar with their name and reputation. Fire isn't being awakened to be the Nomad. They're here to be puppeted by people who only want the vampire as a means to an end. Their actual bloodline is irrelevant. I called the writing clumsy earlier. I criticized the use of deliberately annoying characters. I said the conversation with Damsel was embarrassing. But whoever wrote the broader plot had a clear idea in mind, and it is executed to perfection. Why then did they allow these side quests to be in the game? 20 years ago, a video game was released that failed to meet expectations. The game's publisher rushed the developers toward a deadline that was too soon, and all of the brilliant ideas within the game were undercut by a handful of problems that could have been easily ironed out. That brilliance didn't go unnoticed, and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines has been enjoying cult classic status since it was released. 20 years later, the story has repeated itself. A publisher meddled with a game full of brilliant ideas, and it was released before its problems could be resolved. The problems have again shaped the game's reception, and it falls to the dedicated to quarry the diamonds that are here in abundance. Things are different. One game boasts much greater mechanical depth and more engaging conversations. The other is more mechanically refined and features a stronger narrative overall. But the times are different too. Video game consumption and review have become far more reflexive. People are completing a single playthrough in 1 or 2 sittings, and then writing videos and blog posts decrying the downfall of the medium as part of a running meta-narrative of their own. The turnaround for these reviews are much higher than professional outfits of the past, so it's no wonder that deeper ideas within modern games aren't often discussed. And I think the Chinese Room and Paradox know this. They embarked upon this endeavor to give the people the Bloodlines sequel they said they wanted, but they were never going to succeed at doing that. And in their hubris, they accidentally produced a game that ticks all of the Bloodlines boxes, which at least makes me happy. I like Bloodlines 1, warts and all. And I like Bloodlines 2, all the same.